From Washington, the McLaughlin Group, the American original. For over 3 decades, the sharpest minds, best sources, hardest talk.
Issue 1, Coming to America.
Got a dream to take from there. They're coming to America.
Their parents need to know that this is an incredibly dangerous situation, and it is unlikely that their children will be able to stay.
President Obama visited Texas this week and addressed the surge of adults and unaccompanied children who are crossing into the United States illegally. Over the past 10 months, 52,000 unaccompanied children have crossed the U.S.-Mexican border, with 3/4 of them originating in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Local detention centers in Texas, Arizona, and California have been overwhelmed by the influx. Attempts at housing the immigrants elsewhere in the country have been met with resistance and protest. President Obama, on his fundraising trip to Dallas, Texas, declined to visit the somewhat distant Texas-Mexico border and was criticized by both Republicans and Democrats for failing to do so. After all, he had Air Force One, but he dismissed the visit nonetheless.
So there's nothing that is taking place down there that I am not intimately aware of and briefed on. This isn't theater. This is a problem. I'm not interested in photo ops. I'm interested in solving a problem.
The president said this knowing that Texas Governor Rick Perry wanted the nation's leader to see the complexity of the situation firsthand.
What has to be addressed is the security of the border. You know that, I know that, the President of the United States knows that. I don't believe he particularly cares whether or not the border of the United States is secure.
The two men met at the Dallas airport, and in a meeting with other elected officials, they discussed the border problem. In a later CBS interview, Governor Perry likened the president's refusal to visit the border to former President George Bush's Katrina moment, when Mr. Bush did not visit New Orleans after a hurricane devastated that city until many days later.
The parallel for me is that when we know a hurricane is coming, we put things into place so that we can deal with it. I have told this administration, and others have told this administration for years, that this was exactly what was going to happen.
Question. In its February 2014, 6 months ago, budget proposal, the Department of Health and Human Services requested funding for an anticipated 60,000 unaccompanied minors at the Texas border. Is that 6 months evidence that Obama, the White House, knew all along about the borders, namely that they would be swamped? Pat Buchanan.
John, it is an argument that fulfills what people have been saying, that Barack Obama is asleep at the switch. He is not a hands-on president. Things are going on that he never knows about until afterwards, Benghazi and all the rest of it. But more than that, his failure or refusal not to call an audible and go down to the border when Henry Cuellar, a Democratic congressman who's got a border district down there, said come on down and is comparing him to Katrina, indicates this is a serious problem for the president. But more important, he's not running again. This border issue, John, this issue is going to metastasizing, and this is going to be, I believe, border security, whole immigration issue. It will kill reform, and it's going to be a major issue in the politics of 2016.
Hello.
Well, the administration knew for many months that the numbers of unaccompanied minors were flowing across the border, so it was not a surprise, and they were trying to put the resources in place to deal with it. He didn't go to the border. If he'd gone, you'd be accusing him of grandstanding, I'm sure. But I think you can't argue that you don't like photo ops and then spend 3 days on the road essentially doing photo ops, meeting with voters in a diner and shooting pool and all of that. So I think the optics are terrible. But the meeting with Governor Perry, they found lots of agreement. The President has said he's open to the National Guard. He has deployed the National Guard to the border once or twice before. President Bush also did. Maybe this is time to think about, putting some troops along the border as a deterrent. But in the meantime, these are children that have been sent here by desperate parents to get them away from, for boys, what is the equivalent of assassination squads. The gangs rule these places, and for girls it's sex trafficking. And you know, both parties are complicit in this, because legislation passed by voice vote, bipartisan, in 2008, signed by President Bush, basically said these children should get due process and should be treated as refugees. And I don't think we want to walk away from that. We have to really remember what this country stands for.
On January 29th of this year, the federal government issued a bid for vendors to handle an influx of 65,000 unaccompanied minors. January the 29th. So there was a lot of notice given to this. Is this evidence that the Obama administration knew the numbers would surge this year? I ask you.
Absolutely is evidence of that, but let's also remember that the Republican-controlled House also knew about it. Both sides of the aisle are complicit in this, John. Barack Obama obviously made a total PR blunder by not going down to the border. His entire message would have resonated far more deeply had he done it from a theater stage like that, whether he denies it or not. However, what we have to consider is that he's actually now said to the Congress, discreetly, in a letter 2 weeks ago, he's open to changing the legal structure right now to give his departments the power to kick illegal immigrants out more easily, particularly from Honduras and Guatemala. And he's kicked it over to the Republicans in Congress, and what are they doing with it? Right now they're arguing about whether or not to fund the very initiatives that Rick Perry is asking for. So both sides are complicit in this.
Hold on, Mort. Okay, the payout. The president has asked Congress for $3.7 billion to deal with the Texas crisis. Here's the money breakdown. $1.8 billion for child care, food, shelter, and medicine via the Department of Health and Human Services. $1.1 billion for the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE, within the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. With that $1.1 billion including expenses for undocumented adults traveling with children, their detention and removal. Another separate disbursement, $433 million for Homeland Security's Customs and Border Protection. Also, $64 million for teams of immigration judges, expansion of courtroom capacity, and lawyers to assist both the detainees and the U.S. government. And $295 million to quote-unquote repatriate and reintegrate migrants to Central America, a.k.a. send them back. For the funding of media campaigns in Central America to discourage migration, to the U.S. warning that such journeys to the U.S. are very dangerous, and children will be sent back if they are unaccompanied. $5 million. Question, is money the answer to this growing calamity, Morton? And you can also reflect on the previous question.
Well, of course, it's a part of the answer. There's no question about it. We're going to have to expand the court system. We're going to have to expand the officers who are patrolling the borders. We're going to have to expand all kinds of support facilities for a lot of these people who are coming in, whatever we may do on the border. The problem is, and look, it's always been the case in the United States, the president is the person who symbolizes policy. And for him to have a drink at a bar, you know, instead of going down to the border, just is a terrible public relations for him and gives people the sense that he doesn't care. It may be unfair, but you're president of the United States, you've got to show up, and he didn't show up.
John, but look, this problem has existed since I ran in 1991, down on the border. Terrible problem then in San Diego. It's a failure of both parties, Congresses of both parties, presidents of both parties, both Bushes, and it's a disaster for this country. And quite frankly, John, one of the problems is the United States will not call up the government of Mexico, the president of Mexico, and tell him, look, you are letting these children walk up to our border and walk into our country, and you're going to stop doing that, or you're going to cancel NAFTA. And then you call up the Central American presidents, say, if you want another dime in foreign aid, you're going to deal with it at home and not create this problem for us.
But before 9/11, people in Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador would come to this country rather freely and work at very low wages, and they would send money back, and they would leave their children in these countries. After 9/11, the gates came down, and now these children are coming. They want to be reunited with parents they haven't seen for a decade.
Well, tell the
and
parents to go home.
I don't think that's the answer, Pat. When
Okay.
people have made their lives here,
If they've broken
that's the well, that's what Congress is sorting out. If they broke it in, they've broken in because our businesses want to employ them. We want them to take care of our children.
Well,
they deserve something in return.
Okay, Republican House Speaker John Boehner responds to President Obama's request for money to deal with the immigration crisis.
Our priorities are clear. Take care of these children, return them safely home to their home countries, to their families, and secure the border. I sent a letter to the President last month laying out some specific actions that he should take to address the crisis, including sending in the National Guard. The National Guard is uniquely qualified to address these types of humanitarian crises, and utilizing their expertise would free up border agents to focus on their job of securing the border. Now, the President said yesterday he'd consider doing that only if he gets more money with no strings attached. In other words, he won't do it for the kids. It's all about politics. This is a problem of the President's own making. He's been president for 5.5 years. When is he going to take responsibility for something?
Question, is this a problem of the President's own making, as Speaker Boehner asserts? Guy Taylor.
I think to some degree it is, and I think that's why John Boehner just took off like an airplane, so to speak, and began turning this into hyper-politics. At the same time, however, Boehner is not offering a real solution. The Obama request, the White House request to Congress for the money specifically said, tell me how you want the money spent. So rather than ranting from the podium, John Boehner could be saying, we're preparing that right now, and it's going to include National Guard, and we'll give you the money if you do this.
There's going to be legislation on the floor in the Senate pretty soon. It'll probably pass. Then it'll go to the House, and let's see what John Boehner does. He could pass comprehensive immigration reform based on that Senate bill. It would pass in a minute.
He would
Democrats
would no longer be Speaker.
He may no longer be Speaker anymore, and I don't think that his job matters that much to anybody in this country.
At the same time, Mr. Perry,
Pat, quickly.
Reform is dead, and Mr. Perry, if he's a wise man, and I think he's pretty smart, can ride this issue into the primaries because it is a blazing issue. It has gone national now. It's been on television. Take a look at Drudge. He must have 30 stories about it up on his website. Right. It's gone on for weeks now.
Taken off.
And Obama is on the defensive.